The first thing they heard was a laugh. Not a scream, not a plea, not the dry rasp of someone resigned to their death. A laugh, sharp, unhinged, echoing across the jagged cliffs of the hunting moon like someone had just won the lottery at the edge of a volcano. Every hunter froze. On this moon, in the dead silence of pre-kill stalking, the laugh cut through their instincts like a scalpel. That was the first sign that something was very wrong. That was when the lead hunter, a war-scarred brute called Krolthax, turned to his crew and said the words that would be repeated across every comm network replaying this hunt in the weeks to come. "Pray don't laugh like that." Griff Hale stood atop a rusting hulk of a satellite dish, arms outstretched, as if mocking crucifixion. The wind whipped his tattered jacket around like a cape. Around him, the ancient remains of a mining outpost lay half swallowed by the planet's greedy terrain. And far beyond the dunes, cloaked in shimmering stealth tech, 23 of the deadliest beings in the galaxy had just realized their quarry wasn't hiding. He was announcing himself. Griff tilted his head toward the nearest high-frequency sensor and grinned like a man auditioning for insanity. "Boys," he said, voice amplified through their neurocomms like a whisper in their ears. "Tag, you're it." A blue-skinned sniper in the western quadrant twitched his trigger finger. The older hunter beside him slapped his hand down. "No," he warned. "He's baiting us." But the younger one didn't listen. He fired. The plasma bolt struck Griff square in the chest. And then Griff exploded into birds. Dozens of them. Mechanical, featherless, shrieking in synthetic defiance as they scattered into the sky. A hologram. A trap. The sniper's visor blinked red once before his neural link shorted out. Then he dropped, twitching in silence. Somewhere out there, hidden among their numbers, the real Griff watched from a crevice, one boot wedged against a wall of fractured steel, sipping from a thermos. Mint cocoa. Still warm. He chuckled into the rim. They had no idea. The galactic hunt was meant to be the pinnacle of predatory elegance. Every 100 years, the apex species of the Orion Compact sent their best to a specially chosen prey world. The prey was supposed to run. Scream. Maybe put up a fight, if they had claws or clever legs. But Earth's final candidate didn't run. He set the table, plated the meal, and invited them over, only to poison the wine. Griff wasn't a soldier anymore, though his time in the United Earth Resistance had turned him into something that looked like one. He wasn't a scientist, though he understood xenobiology better than half the PhD squids on the Hunter Council. What Griff was trouble. Organized trouble. The kind that left notes. Booby-trapped ones. His neural uplink hummed. One of the heavier hunters, probably the crust-back brute from the Shinar system, just triggered a field snare. He grinned. That one would wake up wrapped in laughter gas vines and shame. 2 others had been circling to flank the satellite wreckage, thinking they had the drop on him. They didn't. One stepped into a zone where the gravity flickered like a strobe light set to fury. The other fired at what he thought was Griff and nailed his own reflection from a mirrored drone. That one screamed, and Griff made a mental note to replay it later. Maybe remix it with some jazz. What the hunters couldn't know, was that this moon had once hosted a human Black Ops training facility. Forgotten after the collapse, the place was buried beneath layers of system corruption and forgotten war records. Griff knew because he'd helped build it. He'd helped test the AI targeting range that never missed twice. He'd personally calibrated the behavioral minefields that adapted mid-pursuit. And now, all of it, every trap, every misdirection, every psychological knife, was his. The hunters thought they'd come for a kill. What they'd actually walked into was a one-man maze designed by a lunatic with a grudge and no bedtime. A voice crackled over his comlink. Gruff, calculating. Vrex. The tactician? Griff remembered him from the Council's profile dossier. Pragmatic, efficient, humorless. "We don't understand your objective, human," Brex said. "You should be hiding. Escaping. Yet you're mocking us?" Griff sipped again. "Hiding's boring. Escaping's temporary. I prefer long-term humiliation. You know, the kind that shows up in therapy centuries from now." He paused, then added, "Also, you guys made this way too easy." Across the rocky basin, a shimmer revealed Krolthax stalking toward what looked like a wounded version of Griff, limping and bleeding, leaning on a cane made of bone. Krolthax's mandibles clicked in anticipation. His species didn't believe in quick kills. They believed in ceremonial humiliation. Prey should beg before the end. He stepped forward, activated his net launcher, and fired. The net passed straight through. Another hologram. And then the ground beneath him erupted. Griff had buried a sonic feedback loop under the stone, one tuned specifically to Krolthax's inner ear frequency. The giant hunter fell like a collapsing monument, groaning, clutching his skull as his balance shredded itself. Griff winced. "Oof. That's gotta hurt. I mean, not as much as your ego, but still." He moved again, fast, darting through tunnels only he knew, blind to cameras, protected by masking fields and neural camouflage. Every step he took made another hunter panic. Made another shoot where they shouldn't. Griff was no longer being hunted. He was orchestrating a descent into madness. And they hadn't even gotten to the real fun yet. The game had only begun, and Griff was already 10 moves ahead. What no one understood, not the hunters, not the viewers across the galaxy watching through hacked feeds, not even the Galactic Council, was that Griff didn't come to survive this hunt. He came to end it. Publicly. Permanently. Because somewhere, out beyond the cameras, there was a child who'd lost their parents to these so-called noble sports. There was a sister waiting for word from a brother who vanished on a hunt years ago. There were a million quiet ghosts, and Griff Hale was their loudest echo. So he laughed again. Not because he was insane. Not because he didn't fear death. But because he knew something they didn't. The hunters had brought weapons. He had brought a plan. They brought tradition. He brought evolution. And somewhere, as the signal relays bounced his laughter through space, someone watching in a far-off bar whispered the new legend to the person next to them: never corner a human who's smiling. Never trust one who's laughing. And never, ever try to hunt Griff Hale. Krolthax's body was still twitching where it had collapsed, his massive limbs flailing like a toppled mech. When the others finally realized something chilling, none of them had eyes on Griff. No visuals, no life signs, not even thermal. One of the scouts, a thin-limbed insectoid with 4 optic clusters, scuttled over to examine the net trap's remains. He scanned the area, expecting residual heat signatures. Instead, his visor blinked and displayed an error message. The words were not in any known galactic language. They were in English. It read, "Whoops. Wrong door." A beat later, the scanner exploded in a burst of colorful smoke and confetti. The insectoid screamed. From somewhere unseen, Griff's voice followed. "Now that's entertainment." What had started as a carefully orchestrated hunt was now spiraling into what some would later call a tactical circus. The hunters regrouped, forming a loose perimeter around the central ridge, weapons humming and eyes darting toward shadows that didn't behave like shadows should. A new plan was hastily agreed upon. Vrex, the strategist, took command. He was the only one who hadn't attempted to rush Griff, and therefore the only one who hadn't been humiliated. Yet. Vrex ordered half the team to fan out, form a containment loop, and flush Griff toward the western cliffs where drones could trap him. The other half would hold position as a net to catch him if he tried to circle back. It was solid. Clean. Foolproof. And it would have worked, if they hadn't been dealing with someone like Griff. As the team spread into their flanking formation, 2 members were immediately compromised. One stepped into a narrow canyon and was bombarded by a swarm of mimic wasps. Each wasp took on the appearance of the hunter's worst fear, then laughed in Griff's voice. The other was snagged by what appeared to be a friendly, injured teammate, until the clone exploded into a puff of blinding powder, temporarily erasing his vision and frying his aim assist. From his perch high above the ravine, Griff watched with growing amusement. He named this phase of the hunt the confusion spiral. It was designed not just to dismantle the team physically, but to unravel their communication. He had hacked their internal channels using a simple piggyback off their early tracking pulses. Now he could slip in and out of their comms at will. Sometimes he whispered random Earth trivia into their helmets. Other times he repeated their own words back to them in distorted echoes. And every once in a while, he just laughed. A different kind of laugh each time. One that started to burrow under their armored skin. A four-eyed brute named Grish broke formation first. He swung wildly at a shifting hologram that flickered to resemble his brother, killed in a previous hunt on another planet. He screamed his name, then chased the mirage into the dense canyon fog, vanishing from sight. Moments later, there was a loud splash and a wet crunch. Griff sighed. "Didn't even read the sign," he muttered. A warning had been carved into the canyon edge: "Caution, fake floor." Underneath was a reservoir of extremely acidic sludge. That particular trap hadn't even been meant for them. It was a leftover from the mining facility's pest control system. Rex noticed the deteriorating discipline and doubled down. He ordered all hunters to stop responding to auditory distractions. "Mute everything unless it's visual verification," he commanded. Griff, of course, had anticipated this. He activated the pulse projectors scattered around the cliffs, and suddenly, dozens of Griffs appeared, projected in full color, high resolution, some dancing, others running, a few even doing stand-up routines. One projection stood on a rock and shouted, "Knock, knock!" A hunter instinctively replied, "Who's there?" The explosion knocked out his left leg servos. By the time the central cluster realized they were boxed in by visual chaos, 2 more were missing. One had fallen into a trench lined with neural gel, paralyzed instantly. The other was dragged away by an autonomous training bot Griff had reprogrammed to think in Shakespearean insults and punch like a freight hauler. All across the hunter network, panic levels spiked. Systems flagged Griff not as prey, but as an anomalous threat. A new designation was issued: Predator Class Non-Standard. Back at the observation station orbiting the moon, the Galactic Council's entertainment panel was losing their collective minds. Ratings for the broadcast were spiking higher than any previous hunt in recorded history. Children were imitating Griff's laugh. Memes were being generated in real time. Merchandisers were already pitching laughing ghosts, action figures. But among the chaos, one counselor, an old veteran of the first hunt generation, leaned forward and said, "This isn't sport anymore. This is dismantlement." Down on the moon, Griff was enjoying himself too much to care. He'd activated Phase 2, infiltration. Using the mimic suit he'd cobbled together from stealth fabric and signal scramblers, he slipped into the perimeter of the hunters. For the next 20 minutes, he walked among them undetected. At one point, he stood shoulder to shoulder with a towering hunter and whispered, "You ever wonder if we're the real monsters?" before vanishing into a blink field. The hunter shrieked and fired in every direction. 2 of his own teammates went down before they restrained him. Rex had enough. He reconfigured his visor to track not the prey, but the disturbances, zones where too much didn't add up. He followed the energy footprints and finally caught a fleeting glimpse of Griff, only it wasn't Griff. It was a decoy wearing his face, rigged with a transmitter broadcasting false heartbeats. But Rex kept pushing, kept tracking, until he finally isolated a pattern too chaotic to be automated. It was human. It was Griff. He moved fast, dropping decoys and traps as he sprinted toward a rocky bend. There, crouched behind a cluster of fungal rocks, was the real Griff, smiling. Rex raised his rifle. "No more tricks," he said. Griff raised both hands. "Scout's honor," he said. "You got me." And then he pressed something behind his back. The cliffside behind Rex detonated in a burst of color and force, not enough to kill, but enough to knock the rifle from his hands. Rex charged. The 2 tumbled through the dust, grappling, fists landing with meaty thuds. Griff didn't fight like a soldier. He fought like someone who'd watched thousands of alien combat styles, then made up his own. He headbutted, spun, jabbed with elbows, laughed when Rex slammed him into the dirt. That laugh never stopped. It echoed, relentless, infuriating. Finally, Rex managed to pin him down, claw to throat. "Why?" he demanded. "Why do all this? Why not just run?" Griff coughed blood grinning through it. "Because," he said, "running ends with a body. This ends with a lesson." And then Rex's wrist module beeped. A soft tone, followed by silence. His command link was dead. His connection to the Hunter network, cut. He looked down at it, confused, then up at Griff. Griff's grin widened. Tag! Then the second explosion went off. As smoke swallowed the crater, Rex lay still, dazed but alive. Griff was gone again. But now, he had what he needed, a crack in the Hunter chain, a severed command node. They weren't just panicking anymore. They were turning on each other. And the real hunt was about to begin. The footage of Rex being blasted into a pit of his own confusion played on repeat across 1,000 galactic feeds. Across star systems, on pleasure ships and slum stations, in noble houses and back-alley betting dens, spectators roared with laughter or leaned forward with disbelief. The Laughing Ghost, as Griff was now dubbed, had not only humiliated the Hunters, he'd done it with style. And now, no one could look away. The viewership for the Galactic Hunt broadcast had officially surpassed any known hunt in history, and the sponsors were throwing credits at the network like it was a divine lottery. The only problem was that the show was no longer following the script. The Hunters were no longer dominating. And the prey? He was directing the whole spectacle like an actor in his own twisted stage play. Griff knew. Oh, he knew. He was watching the live feeds from a stolen scout tablet, legs kicked up on the dashboard of a ruined hovertruck deep in the underground cavern system. He had a half-eaten protein bar in one hand and a remote detonator in the other. The moment he saw a particularly arrogant hunter named Cernus sneaking into the mouth of the cave, Griff tapped the button. A floor panel beneath Cernus opened like the jaws of a god, swallowing him whole. A few seconds later, Cernus's scream was replaced by a soft crunch, then silence. The camera feed went dead. Griff chuckled to himself. Should have brought a flashlight. The deeper point of all this wasn't the traps. It wasn't even the embarrassment. It was the collapse of control. Hunters like these lived for dominance. For the rules. For tradition. By dragging them into the chaos of his mind, Griff wasn't just hurting them. He was breaking something inside them. Fear wasn't their default setting. But now, it was the only one left. Back on the surface, the surviving hunters were fracturing. Blame spiraled between factions. Some claimed Rex had led them into a trap. Others believed Griff had infiltrated the command net again. One hunter, a serpentine tracker named Zila, snapped and tried to take leadership by force. Her challenge ended when her plasma spear activated one of Griff's reflective bubble shields, bouncing her own shot into her chest. The resulting blast vaporized her torso. The others took a step back, finally realizing they weren't losing the hunt. They were being dismantled piece by piece, from the inside out. Griff's voice came again, this time through the audio channels they couldn't block no matter how they tried. It didn't come as a taunt. Not immediately. This time, it was laughter layered with something else, a question. You ever wonder, he said slowly, why it's always us humans who break the rules? Why we don't just die when we're told to? Why we make fun of the monsters that try to eat us? No one answered, of course. The hunters had stopped speaking by then. Too busy scanning, twitching, watching every shadow like it had teeth. Griff continued. I'll tell you why. It's because we've been hunted since the day we picked up sticks. We got real good at pretending we were prey, while turning into predators. That's why you're losing. You came here thinking I'd be afraid. That I'd run. But I've been hunted before. By worse things than you. And you know what I did back then? I laughed. He ended the broadcast with a simple sound. A slow, rising cackle that turned into a roar, like madness echoing through a canyon. Down in the command bunker buried beneath the moon's southern ridge, Rex stirred. His helmet was cracked, his armor scorched, but he was alive. And he was furious. Not because he'd lost. No, he was past pride. What burned in his chest now was something else: curiosity. He wanted to understand how Griff had done it. How he had turned a death match into a theater production where the audience couldn't look away and the performers begged for the curtain to fall. He limped through the abandoned corridors, scanning what Griff had left behind. Booby traps, sure. But also logs. Messages carved into metal with laser etchers. One simply read, "You were never in control." Another, "This isn't a hunt. This is a lesson." Each one burned deeper than a plasma wound. And then Vrex found it. A room filled with monitors, all set up to broadcast not just the hunter's actions, but their reactions. Facial scans. Emotion charts. Pulse readings. Griff had been studying them like a wildlife expert observing panicked animals. And worse, he had recorded his findings. He had categorized their reactions to fear, humiliation, rage, guilt. Vrex played one recording, and Griff's voice began narrating. Species Zalari folds under visual pressure. Displays fragmentation under conflicting stimuli. Recommend triple decoy deployment before engaging. Shinarian combatants rely on pack dominance, separate the alpha, and the rest disband. Vrex shut it off. That wasn't a trap. That was research. That was doctrine. Griff wasn't just escaping, he was gathering material for a playbook. One that could be used against the hunters again. And again. And again. Meanwhile, on the Galactic network, the Council had finally convened to discuss the implications. One faction wanted to call the hunt off entirely, pull the remaining survivors out, and declare a blackout. Another, more ruthless group, wanted to escalate, drop in support units, override Griff's network, and crush him before the legend could spread too far. But neither faction got the last word. That belonged to an old man with scars across his face and a voice like gravel. He simply said, "Let it play out. He's showing us who we are. And more importantly, he's showing the galaxy what we're not." Down below, Griff was almost ready. He stood atop the highest ridge, looking down on the shattered formations of hunters who had now turned their weapons on each other. Mistrust had reached fever pitch. One false move and they'd tear each other apart. All he needed to do was light the fuse. And he had just the match. From his belt, Griff pulled a signal flare. He aimed it into the sky and launched it. It burst into a giant image, his face, grinning wide. Underneath, words scrolled in Galactic Common. It was never about survival. It was about exposure. Then, using every hijack signal he could manage, he triggered the last audio feed. No speech this time. Just a sound clip. A laugh. His laugh. On loop. Played in reverse. Slowed down. Layered. And the galaxy listened. They watched as the hunters, once paragons of strength and order, scrambled, fought, fell apart. Not from enemy fire. But from fear. From doubt. From a single, unkillable human whose only weapon was unpredictability and a twisted sense of humor. Griff sat back, watching the sun set across the cratered landscape, the glow of flames dancing below. In that moment, he wasn't just a survivor. He was a legend being born in real time. And he was just getting started. The flare faded, but its afterimage burned in the minds of every survivor below. The giant smiling face of Griff Hale had hung over the battlefield like a deity of mockery, its looping laugh echoing through every channel, every helmet, every broken shred of pride still clinging to the hunters. One of them, a silent spear wielder from the Krellish clans, dropped his weapon mid-scan and simply walked into the fog. He didn't speak. He didn't run. He just left, like a man stepping out of a nightmare, and hoping the next one would be quieter. Another hunter, a cyborg hybrid from the Mecran Forge, turned her plasma cannon on her own squadmates after her visual sensors glitched, showing her reflections of Griff walking between them. By the time she realized the truth, 3 of her allies were dead, and she had a dozen holes melting through her frame. Up on the ridge, Griff watched it all, quiet now, the show nearly over. The moon's thin air smelled like burnt metal and ionized dust. His traps were mostly spent, his mimic suit damaged and flickering, but it didn't matter anymore. He hadn't just survived the hunt. He had inverted it. What remained below wasn't a squad of elite apex predators. It was a scattering of broken creatures clinging to protocol and paranoia. Some still tried to regroup, whispering commands and fallback points, but none of them trusted each other anymore. And Griff knew once trust died, everything else followed. He slid down the ridge, boots skidding on loose gravel, and stepped into the open like a man taking a morning walk. One of the hunters, half buried behind cover, spotted him and raised a weapon. Griff didn't flinch. He raised his hands in mock surrender and said, "Go ahead. Take the shot. Be the first one to actually hit me." The hunter hesitated. The others turned. Weapons leveled. Tension crackled. Then Griff laughed again. And none of them fired. Instead, a ripple moved through the crowd. Shoulders lowered. Breathing slowed. One of them, a long-limbed stalker named Ress, tossed his rifle into the dirt. "I'm done," he muttered. "I came to hunt prey, not be used in a joke." Another hunter nodded. Then another. And just like that, their resolve crumbled. They didn't drop dead. They dropped out. A wave of resignation, more complete and devastating than any weapon, swept through them. Minutes later, a small dropship descended onto the battlefield. It was sleek, unmarked, shimmering in diplomatic silver rather than military black. It didn't come with guns. It came with an observer from the Galactic Council. Tall, regal, for eyes glinting with something between amusement and horror, the observer stepped out and scanned the scene. Around them, elite hunters sat slumped against rocks, some nursing wounds, others simply staring at the ground as if unsure how it all had gone so wrong. The observer walked toward Griff, who stood in the center of it all like a conductor after the final note. "This was not the outcome we expected," the observer said quietly. Griff wiped some blood from his lip and grinned. "Yeah. Me either. I was hoping for more fireworks, but you take what you can get. You've humiliated the best warriors in the galaxy." "I didn't humiliate anyone," Griff replied. "They did that all on their own. I just sped up the process." The observer studied him. "Why?" Griff shrugged. "Because I was tired of being hunted. Because my species was written off like a footnote in your hunt logs. Because you thought you could parade us around like clever animals and clap when we got shot in the back. And because somebody needed to show you what happens when the prey decides to write the rules." A silence passed between them. Then the observer held out a small data crystal. "The council requests this. Everything you used. Every strategy. Every system you hacked. Every trap you laid. We want to study it." Griff arched an eyebrow. "Study it? Use it," the observer corrected. "Teach it. Sell it. Whatever word makes you feel better. What you did here wasn't just spectacle. It was tactical evolution." Griff took the crystal slowly. "You want to turn my rebellion into a curriculum." The observer nodded. "That, or leave this as a whisper. Your choice. But understand, your name's already been carved into a dozen languages. Children are mimicking your laugh. Soldiers are asking how you did it. You can vanish. Or you can steer the chaos you created." Griff looked around at the field. Not a battlefield anymore, just a wasteland littered with confusion, gear, and the shattered illusions of superiority. Then he looked at the data crystal, and back at the observer. "Fine," he said. "I'll give you the playbook. But I write the foreword." Later, on a cargo ship headed for the neutral zone, Griff sat alone in a dimly lit cabin, watching the stars blur by. A screen beside him played clips from the hunt, his hologram dancing, a trap going off, a hunter screaming after chasing a decoy off a cliff. The screen then cut to the final feed, him, standing in the middle of the broken hunters, laughing while they looked on, helpless. He didn't smile. Not now. Now that it was over, the weight of it pressed in from the edges. Not guilt, he felt none of that, but gravity. The knowledge that he had permanently changed something he wasn't sure he wanted to be responsible for. He hadn't just survived. He'd created a template. And in the wrong hands, a template could become doctrine. But then again, maybe it needed to. Maybe the galaxy needed a reminder that fear wasn't the apex emotion. That unpredictability was a weapon. That laughter wasn't weakness, it was defiance made sound. 1 year later, a new class opened at the Intergalactic Tactical Institute. Enrollment doubled overnight. The course was called Psychological Warfare, the Griff Hale Method. First lesson? Never corner a human who's smiling. Second lesson? If that human starts laughing, run. Griff didn't attend the opening ceremony. He didn't need to. His legend walked in before him. But he did show up for the first lecture, stepping onto the platform in a simple jacket and worn boots, hands tucked in his pockets like he hadn't rewritten the laws of the hunt. The students waited. Tension thick. Cameras rolling. Griff looked at them all, then leaned forward and said, "Class is in session." Then he laughed. And the galaxy laughed with him. Or maybe at him. But no one ever tried to hunt him again. It had been a year since the moon they once called a proving ground was renamed Griffin's End, and still, no hunter had returned to it. The scars were too fresh, the memories too loud. Even the bravest warriors, the ones who used to carve their trophies from the bones of conquered prey, avoided even speaking the name Griff Hale out loud. Not out of fear of him returning, but because of what he represented. He wasn't just a man anymore. He had become a turning point, a reminder that confidence and tradition could be shredded in the blink of a laugh. On the Hunter homeworlds, training academies added simulations based on his tactics, not to honor him, but because no one wanted another incident like that. They didn't say his name, but they prepared for him. Even in his absence, he was teaching. Griff didn't vanish after the hunt, though many expected him to. He'd been offered power, money, even territory. Entire systems wanted to name him as a consultant for defense. Some even asked if he'd train assassins. But he said no to all of it. He had no desire to turn what he did into an empire. His mission had never been about conquest. It had been about exposure. He had lifted the curtain on the myth of invincibility, not just of the hunters, but of the system that had allowed them to parade superiority as entertainment for centuries. Griff didn't want a throne. He wanted perspective. And maybe a little peace. He spent his time in transit, bouncing from port to port, using backdoors and aliases that were half jokes even to him. On one planet he was Mr. Echo. On another just Laugh Track. But no matter what name he used, someone always recognized him. A bartender would glance twice and lower the volume of the holoscreen. A passing traveler would whisper his laugh to a friend like a secret. Once, a child in a dirty mining colony saluted him with 2 fingers and said, "Thanks for messing up the bullies." That one had stayed with him. Not because the words were grand, but because they were honest. Still, for all the attention, Griff knew it wasn't over. Not really. Some hunter clans had sworn vengeance. They'd lost honor, and those types always needed someone to blame. Griff expected it. Planned for it. In fact, he welcomed it. Because if they came back for him, it meant they hadn't learned. And he was always happy to teach another lesson. He returned to Griffin's End on the anniversary alone. No armor. No weapons. Just a half-broken scout drone and a backpack of supplies. The moon was quiet now, its surface partly reclaimed by time and native overgrowth. Rusted bones of old traps jutted out like fossilized warnings. Pieces of helmets and armor still lay in the dust, untouched. Griff walked through it all like he was visiting an old friend, stepping over memories and between what could have been graves. He came to the place where he had launched the final flare, the place where the hunters had stared at him not as prey, but as something they could not comprehend. He stood there in silence, then set down the drone. The drone blinked to life, scanned the surroundings, then deployed a small uplink antenna. A signal burst into the stars, encrypted, directed. Griff didn't send a message with words. Just coordinates. Just a timestamp. He knew it would reach the right ears. And he knew what it would cause. 3 days later, a sleek vessel descended onto the same ridge. Not a warship, not a dropship. Just a single transport, designed for 1 passenger. When the hatch opened, Vrex stepped out. No helmet. No weapon drawn. Just him. A year older, a little slower, but still sharp in the eyes. He saw Griff standing there and gave a small nod. "You came alone," Griff said. "You knew I would," Vrex replied. They stood in silence a while, watching the wind stir the red dust between them. Vrex finally asked, "Why bring me back here?" Griff motioned to the broken battlefield. "Because this place is rotting under the weight of what we did. I thought maybe we could decide what it means, instead of letting everyone else do it for us." Vrex studied him. "You think we can fix it?" "No," Griff said. "But we can choose what story they remember. Right now, I'm the guy who broke your system. The joke that became a threat. But I don't want to be a punchline they turn into fear. I want them to learn. And if that means standing here with the only person who ever came close to understanding what this was, then so be it." Vrex walked forward slowly, scanning the old terrain. "I've watched your lectures. You know that? They made your laugh a study module. Half the students fail because they flinch when the audio plays." Griff laughed, soft and real. "That's not failure. That's awareness." Vrex chuckled. "You're still impossible. And yet here we are." They spent the day walking the ruins, talking about every move, every misdirection, every mistake. They argued, laughed, disagreed. But more than anything, they rebuilt a version of events that both could accept. One that didn't frame Griff as a monster or a miracle. Just a man who refused to be cornered and found a way to turn chaos into survival. By nightfall, they lit a fire near the old satellite dish, the same one Griff had stood atop when it all began. They shared rations, watched the stars, and let silence settle comfortably between them. "I don't hate you, you know," Vrex said after a while. "I know. I just hate that you were right." Griff stared into the fire. "That makes two of us." When Vrex finally left the next morning, he took with him a revised data core. One that stripped the spectacle and kept the core of the message. Resilience. Adaptability. Humility. The real traits that turn prey into something more. And Griff stayed behind. He didn't stay because he was hiding. He stayed because Griffin's End had become more than a battlefield. It had become a monument. Not to victory, but to choice. The choice to disrupt, to rethink, to challenge power with unpredictability and wit. And somewhere deep inside, Griff knew that this was his last lesson. Not the traps. Not the tricks. But the decision to stay put. To let the world come to him now, on his terms. When a young cadet found him years later, older now, hair grayer, posture a little stiffer, she asked him if he missed the chaos. Griff smiled and said, "Chaos still sends me postcards." Then he laughed. And somewhere across the galaxy, someone paused. Because that laugh was never just a sound. It was the signal that things were about to change.